Thank you very much. Thank you for the honor of being here tonight. While the thing is organized, I want to tell you in the spirit in which I have thought about this meditation for the 50th anniversary of Ludwig Fleck. A meditation because it's very difficult to get into an author which has been so important in the field which I, with others, began to recreate. We thought we were creating it, but it was actually already created. So the way I approached the question was to frame this meditation in a way which I found Fleckian, which is what sort of dire situation in which we now are. I think we are in the age of the extreme, but in a very different sense. And in what sense someone of his interest in the sciences would have tried to develop the possibility of thinking about life and democracy in a different way. So for technical reasons, I will show you first a little film about another character I want to bring into contact with Fleck, doing a little experiment. This is Dr. Lovelock. He talks on the Canadian television. Lovelock is the inventor of Gaia. So I will meditate afterward with you about what is it. Listen to what he says about humanity and think if the expression age of the extreme is not adapted to our own time.
Of the world that regulates itself, the planet that regulates itself is one thing, but now we're at this point, and one thing we had talked about is you say it's too late. Like we just need to deal with the inevitability. Just for people who perhaps haven't wrapped their head around it, what is your theory that says we're done?
It's not so much a theory, it's coming from observations of what's happening around the Earth. And it's always important. Observations are much more important than theories. We have plenty of theories. No, the Earth's been looking after itself for quite a while in what's called the interglacial, the kind of warm period we're in at the moment. But in the last few years it started warming up. And this is a sign that it's moving away from the current state it's in to, it exists in stable states, either cold, middling or very hot. And it looks as if it's going to the very hot period. And it's been there many times before.
Mm-hmm. And so how long does it take to get to the place where we can no longer... Like, are you saying that... You're not saying the entire human race will be wiped out, but you're saying
Heavens, no, no.
But a significant number. You're not talking about a party here.
I'm afraid so. As many as 7 out of 8 are likely to be wiped out, yes.
Is it certain parts of the globe that are going to be harder hit than others?
Very much so. And Canada...
So you see the experiment I'm trying to make. This is a very nice gentleman who invented Gaia. He speaks on television, and he is very nicely saying that 7/8 of the humanity is going to disappear, and it's not a big deal. Later in the show, he says that there will be lots of nice moments, and there is no clear explanation of how you wipe out 7 out of 8 persons on Earth. And it all is done in a tone which is somewhat relaxed. And that's the mystery of a situation which I want to bring into contact with Lovelock argument. So I want to learn political epistemology, which is, of course, the great importance of the work of Fleck, which is to have invented a way of connecting epistemology and sociology together in an original way, but under the constraint of the time in which we are. And the reason why I'm interested in that is because of a quite traumatic experience of listening to this gentleman, Clive Hamilton from Australia, when he was giving a lecture in Sciences Po. And he showed a slide, which is the slide of an event which has already taken place, according to him, that is the missing moment, the Copenhagen, it's an argument about Copenhagen in 2009, and as you can see from the curves, it's the sort of effort we would have to take had we done the right thing in Copenhagen in 2009, which we missed. So every one of the later curve is, of course, much more dramatic and much more difficult and thus much more unlikely. So the title of his book is very much in the Lovelock tone, it's called Requiem for a Species. And the species is, of course, us, in case you have a doubt. And Lovelock's argument is that everything under 1 kilo has a prime. I mean, everything under 1 kilo will survive, but under 1 kilo is a prime. So the prime is this, the prime of what it is to speak of democracy and science at a time when, of extreme, at a time when we live in a situation which has the tension of the sort of phenomenon with the uncertainty about this phenomenon, the uncertainty of a catastrophe plus the uncertainty of a catastrophe, which has, of course, a strong connection with the very real catastrophes for which Ludwig Fleck lived. The first is that, of course, the idea of a separation between two domains, one of science and one of democracy and social life, is completely moot, because now the whole development of science and technology, the artificialization of the world, and the extent of conflict about each of these details of our existence, not only the climate but everything else, makes the difference between the two domains impossible to sustain. And I will give an example in a moment. So that the very idea that the big question of bringing science and democracy together is participation of the public into decisions seems to be something very much from the 20th century. I mean, it's very much something which is passé, because now the integration is already there, and in a way which has surprised all of us in the science studies community, I think, which is the climate gate. I mean, no one imagined when we are talking about science and democracy, hundreds and hundreds of people getting into the science, into the very detail of the sciences in a way which makes denial of what is probably one of the most certain facts of science disputable. So certainly the whole question of participation of the public was very much different. So that the question, the word I use, and taking from Isabel Stengers to define this sort of new era of the link between science and democracy, is cosmopolitics. But the problem, of course, of cosmopolitics is what sort of cosmos do we need for this cosmopolitics? How do you represent the cosmos? So the reason I will use this word is because I will take democracy, the problem of democracy, more on the side of the object to be represented than about the process by which people are represented. This is linked to the Making Things Public exhibit Michael mentioned before. In democracy there is a demos, but there is a very, very original ways now we live in, and a very uncertain and unstable way in which the demos is displaced and modified by this strange entity which is the Earth as a center of attention, which is also the one in which we are, and also the one on which we act in a way which is qualified by this beautiful word, Anthropocene. So I'm trying a meeting of Fleck and Lovelock around the question of physiology of a cosmos. What is the physiology of a cosmos, and what is the thought collective associated with this physiology? Just one little example of these strange things of participation of the public. This is the website of a group of denialists, I think they are called, not to say negationists, which are organizing citizens to visit the very place where the data stations are produced in order for the big GIC systems of weather prediction and climate modeling to work. So they send posse of critical citizens taking pictures of all the different places when there are climate stations in order to make their own assumptions about what the range of error into the data for the production of a climate is made of. So you see that the question of should people participate to the production of science has taken a very, very different meaning, and that they are already everywhere, and so it's moot now to talk about is this science or is this a question of democracy. Climate Gate has completely changed, I think, the sort of question that we can raise around those things. So there is something which, and here I relate to the end of the book, of Fleck, The Genesis of Scientific Fact, which is not often read as much as the beginning on the Wassermann, the history of the Wassermann study, which is the interest he has in the metaphor of art, because here also the question of democracy is connected to much more than voting and organization. I mean, it's related to, this strange place where we are, the neoclassical and the very heat of the neoclassical. Actually, I'm just talking about the heat of this room, basically, which is the question of the emblem. How do we present what is the visual and emotive datascape in which it's possible for the thought collective to zero in and to choreograph oneself in relation with an event of the size of Gaia, which I'm sure with a subject which have been fascinating for Fleck. And of course, it's not a new thing. If you take the famous fresco, which are the sort of epitome of political philosophy, visual art, in Siena, on the good and bad government, they are very, very, very well known. What is not always seen is that it's also a landscape and an ecosystem. On the top, the good government is actually also a place where they have good architecture, biodiversity, rich landscape, and so on and so forth. And in the bad government, which the Siena's town did not restore as much, which I find interesting. So some of the destruction is there. You have a destroyed, not only unrestored, but a destroyed landscape, a ruin, social contact, horrible houses which are broken, in addition to the devil there. So the big question is what is the equivalent in contemporary cosmopolitics of that sort of representation, and here representation has to be taken in all the sense of the word, of the, not the strange, indifferent enemy, which is Gaia. I'll come back in a minute there. So the same problem, which, a lot of work has been done on the emblem of this fabulous fresco, which summarized 100 years, or a millenary more exactly, of thought about political philosophy. What would be the equivalent now of the emblem necessary to represent the eco-politics in which we are engaged? So that democracy is not just a procedure, but also a way of life in which the thought collective can live at ease. And that's a very important problem, which I think can be related to the question of the thought collective. What is a much extended thought collective? And it has lots of interesting sort of contrast, which I want to go through. But first, let me remind you of a definition of the word of a thought collective. This is from the book, Fleck's book, which is a very important and very famous quote. Direct perception of form requires being experienced in the relevant field of thought. The ability directly to perceive meaning, form, and self-contained unity is required only after much experience, perhaps with preliminary training, which is a very important moment when Fleck takes completely away the tradition of epistemology, away from Kantism, and get into a pragmatic definition of the choreography of a scientist, the laboratory, the collective, and the thing to study, which is, of course, the great discovery that he made in the Genesis of Scientific Fact. And at the same time, of course, we lose the ability to see something that contradicts the form, and that's where all of the connection between Fleck's argument and democracy can be made. But it's just this readiness for directed perception that is the main constituent of thought style. And here the mistake, of course, is often to say, well, this is a traditional argument that we see only what we know. But no, this is exactly the opposite. We are directed by the choreography of being experienced in the relevant field of thought. And that's the original delicate line that Fleck has traced in the definition of epistemology. And here's the definition of a thought collective. If we define thought collective as a community of persons mutually exchanging ideas or maintaining cultural interaction, we will find by implication but it also provides the spatial career for the historical development of any field of thought, as well as for the given stock of knowledge and level of culture. This we have designated thought style. The thought collective that supplies the missing is what thus supplies the missing component. So how do we use this idea, which is a choreography of people experience laboratory and things shaped by this connection, where we begin to zoom on and to learn to, with lots of metaphors of dance and music, with the size of the physiology of Gaia. That's what I'm interested in the experience, to try to relate Fleck to the experience we are in on ecology. Now, here we have to get into some peculiarity of Gaia. Gaia is not a collective, I call it a collection, because no one exactly knows what it is. It's not a character. The name was given to it, as Lovelock explained many times, by Golding from the Lord of the Flies. So he suggests, they are in the same pub together, and Golding suggests Gaia, which has an advantage. It gives a shape, a name, but it has, of course, some disadvantage. I'll come back. And it's indifferent to the human in a very different type of indifference from nature. We are used to all sorts of poems about the indifference of nature. Look at the glaciers there. The glaciers are there and Swiss will disappear and so on and so forth. But the glacier will always be there. Well, no, even in Switzerland, the glacier will no longer be there. So it's a very different type of indifference, and that's why Gaia, in Lovelock's expression, can make the human disappear as you clean a tablecloth. 7/8 of humans disappear. And it's not against us. It's just, c'est un frisson. Gaia frissonne. But of course, the big problem, and this linked to the whole other story about democracy and science, which has to do with the nuclear holocaust during the Cold War, is that the human neither are a unified actor. So there is this strange problem which democracy had never had to absorb, which is a non-unified character with an enemy of a strange sense facing a non-unified character. Humanity is nothing unified on that respect. Having to invent a politics at the scale for which neither the planet nor the humanity is, of course, used to. And yet, they are embedded into one another, which is the most strange things about that. When nature was indifferent to us, that was fine. If you read the beautiful book that Anders wrote about the nuclear holocaust, and when he says, well, we are at the time of the end, yes, but it's not yet the end because the humans disappear, but nature is there. So it's one round more further in this exploration by humanity of the end, of time of the end, sorry. So we are both embedded into one another, and there is absolutely no sense in which the notion of conflict can be used because of this asymmetric war that Lovelock has described in many of his books. One of them is The Revenge of Gaia. It's a very asymmetric, because if humanity wins, it loses, and if it loses, it loses. So it has a strange, uncertain relation with war. And of course, war carries all sorts of metaphors that we are used to, all sorts of attitudes, all sorts of models of reaction and indignation and politics. But this conflict is very bizarre, because precisely there is an uncertainty on the war, and there is an uncertainty on the very existence of both the actors. Even though Lovelock has moved from maverick to somewhat middle science, and the intensity of his argument about Gaia is given and gain credence with the new, every new data on global warming, still there is a big uncertainty, and of course there is a big uncertainty on humanity as a single actor. And yet, they have to be represented. Both of them have to be represented. There is no representative government now possible if we are not able to represent the whole situation, this whole situation of uncertainty of us, which don't exist, versus her, who don't exist either. And we are both, and this will not surprise Fleck, part of an experiment in which we are all guinea pigs, but no one asked to be in it. We are all in a collective experiment around this. And of course, there is in Gaiesque metaphor something, I mean, this is the sort of imagination of a publisher that doesn't give good reputation to Lovelock, of course. This is the worst type of catastrophism. But in fact, he is a very interesting and very precise writer about precisely the problem I'm interested for Gaia. Here are two quotes. You will notice that I'm continuing to use the metaphor of a living Earth for Gaia, but do not assume that I'm thinking of the Earth as alive in a sentient way, or even alive like an animal or a bacterium. I think it's time we enlarge the somewhat dogmatic and limited definition of life as something that reproduces and corrects the error of reproduction by natural selection among the progeny. This is part of this long dispute with Minor Smith and the others about is it possibly for a Darwinian paradigm for Gaia to exist. And there are many answers, as you know, that Lovelock has produced. I have found it useful to imagine the Earth as like an animal, perhaps because my first experience of serious science was in physiology. He was a great man who learned how to congeal guinea pigs. I mean, he was great at freezing guinea pigs and then resuscitating them afterward. That's how it started. It has never been more than metaphor, an aide de la pensée, I guess if that's what he meant. No more serious than the thought of a sailor refers to his ship as she, and he compares then, I thought of the Earth more as a camel. And the argument is this. Metaphor is important because to deal with, to understand, and even ameliorate the fix we are now in of a global change require us to know the true nature of the Earth and imagine it as the largest living thing in the solar system, not something inanimate like the disreputable contraption, spaceship Earth. And of course, this is an interesting problem. Is it a mechanic? Is the Earth a mechanism, or is it a living organism? And spaceship Earth is, of course, something we have as a metaphor, which Lovelock criticized over and over again, because when you are on a spaceship, when something gets wrong, you can say, Houston, we have a problem. Except we can't, because if we say we have a problem, there's no one under the line. So the mechanical metaphor, for that reason, and many others, is wrong. Unless we see the Earth as a planet that behaves as if it were alive, at least to the extent of regulating its climate and chemistry, we will lack the will to change our way of life and to understand that we have made it our greatest enemy. We made it our greatest enemy. Now look at the link between science and politics here, and look at the link between literature, the very explicit reflexive definition of metaphor, and the question of what it is to act. So it's not an argument about democracy, it's an argument about making politically viable, through the notion of a metaphor, the existence of a phenomenon which, strangely enough, in the very last word, we made our enemy. And this is because this very strange character is indifferent to us, but in a very different way from nature before. So my question is, how do you make the problem, how do you solve the question of size for democracy? How is it possible? That's where we are in the age of the extreme. How do you deal with the difference of size? So in a way, of course, Gaia is much too big for us. I mean, even when you have read all the literature on the fact that there is an anthropic origin of climate change, who in this room, looking outside, believes in it? I mean, sorry, no, in the room we believe in it because it's very, very hot. But when you look outside, I mean, the difference of scale is much too big for any one of us individually to believe that it is actually possible to bring back in a political arena. But what is so strange in Gaia, and the discovery, I mean, basically all the ecological crisis, is also the discovery that is very big, but it's also limited. A new era of limits. And so we are suffocating, that's a paradox that Sloterdijk has so beautifully seen, we are suffocating in a space which is nevertheless too big for us. It's too big for us politically to be represented, and yet we are suffocating because we know we have no other Earth than this one. And if we forget, we go to see the Avatar film and we are reminded of that. Pandora's is the place out of which you flee after having been defeated, by the way. So there is a double sort of suffocation, double surprise. We are lost in something too big and suffocating in something too limited. It's very difficult. This double displacement is very, very, very difficult to absorb for the modernist mind that we created in our engineering school, in our science and technology, which everywhere, I mean, which is simultaneously place and infinite. Now it's indefinite and it's suffocatingly limiting, which is a very strange situation. And if there is another double displacement, which is of a great interest, and of course here the political epistemology of Fleck is extremely important because it's exactly the movement he makes. Yes, facts are genesis are produced by humans, and yet they're not. That's the beauty of the book. It's precisely not a social constructivist book. And now we are in a situation 80 years later, which is very odd. We suddenly realize that the anthropocentrism is impossible because we are now looking at some sort of like geocentrism and simultaneously learning that we are a geological force, collectively that is. And as you know, next year in Brisbane, the Geological Society, the little subgroup of the Geological Society dealing with name of era, will probably name the next phase after the Holocene, Anthropocene. So how do we do to reconcile ourselves with this double movement? Human is gone, 7, 8 out of you will disappear. And yet we are a geological force at the size of the Earth. So much so that very serious geologists consider that in addition to the glaciers and mountains there in the Alps, you have to add the humans. All these little puny humans? Yes. Collectively, they are like a volcano, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And that makes a difference, which is in terms of terajoule, which is very funny figures, at the size of plate tectonic, according to them. So this is where to talk about science and democracy and forget that the big problem is about being able to represent this situation would, of course, be somewhat bizarre. Because the question is more how to hold the world on our shoulder in a credible way. And as you know, ecology, and especially deep ecology, but not only, doesn't have an easy relationship with democracy. Actually, Jonas was not a great Democrat, and Lovelock, we don't know. I mean, he's just British, but very happy to see 7/8 of the population disappear without ever explaining how this is done. Oh, no. Oh, heavens, no. See what he says. Is everyone going to disappear? Oh, heavens, no. Just 7/8. Oh, yes, we'll be wiped out. And then later the guy says, is it too late? Oh, yes, I'm afraid so, yes. So the question And here I'm trying to find something maybe which would be the look strange, but not if you have understood my interest in the emblem. I mean, what it is to represent, what it is to visually and aesthetically feel the political question of the 21st century, which has to do with something about Atlas. And of course, the great philosophers of that, the great German philosophers is Peter Sloterdijk. I take that quote, "He is a philosopher, the one who, as an athlete of totality, knows that he is loaded with the weight of the world." And there's a whole book of his, Globe, is entirely on this question of what it is to hold the globes on our shoulders. I'm sure there are some actually up there. Yes, there are plenty of those guys there. So the problem is quite interesting because we don't have a metaphor neither for science nor for the politics of the architecture of cosmopolitics. We don't know how to handle the size of a phenomenon, neither scientifically nor politically, and that's what I'm interested in the reminder of these lectures. It's very hot, so I'll try to speed up to go to the apéro, as you call it, I think, quicker. So the paradox of the global, and here I comment an argument around Sloterdijk, is that there is an inversion in the shape of the globe. When we had the globe, that is where in the thing he called basically the scientific revolution, wow, this might change something. See, we are activating here the air conditioning, natural air conditioning. Can we do that for the Earth? That's really my question, right? Lots of work for engineers, but a very, very different politics. What it is to activate the whole setup in which we are now located and which, all right, okay, you understood the argument. So the paradox is that when we had a globe, there was no globalization in the economic sense of the word, really. And now that we have a globalization, the globe is gone. Remember that this is a beautiful argument that you can make about Mercator. When Mercator invented the notion of Atlas to describe the first cartography of the world, Atlas was actually not the one who held the world on his shoulder, but one who holds the universe in his hands. And you see that it's actually the cosmos that he has in his hands, and the Earth is down there, just as a football. So there is this beautiful inversion that in history of science we have studied over and over again. How can you revert the relation of size between what you are in it and what you hold in your hands? And at the time of the scientific revolution, at the time of scientific optimism, let's say at the time of modernism as an ideal, the world, the globe was what you held. And the gaze of science, the view from nowhere, was actually above and could see the whole thing. What it is for scientists, engineers, politicians, inventors, and simple citizens to be back into a situation where the Earth, the globe, is actually now not what you hold in your hands, but the metaphor is difficult to find, in which you are. I found that image, I don't know. This is a very interesting rethinking of Atlas as a sort of Christic figures of holding the Earth. But we would need much more work on this metaphor because we are in this space that we hold on our shoulder, in which we are, on which we are nevertheless depending. So it's a very bizarre situation which doesn't fit our imaginary space, but of course doesn't fit our political architecture either. So we are in a situation where we are surrounded, like in the beautiful Olafur Eliasson piece, surrounded. And we lack the metaphors to build our own conception of space, and of course we lack, of course, the metaphors to be in the political space as well. Do I have 5 more minutes, Miguel, or are you all dying from 5 minutes? Okay, wait. 10 minutes. 10 minutes? It's even better. So I'm sorry for those who are... So we have passed, and there is a very strange definition of the limits the way we understand the limit is very, very different now, because remember, we all learned from Alexander Koyré, from all the literature in the scientific revolution, that we had passed the time when there was a difference between the infralunar and the supralunar, and that the scientific revolution was precisely to have opened the infinite universe. So and behind us was the old archaic cosmos, well organized, corrupted Earth, but well organized and harmonious in some sort of sense, with the prime that Sloterdijk has worked out of where is God in that thing. But God is no longer the prime, it's Gaia which is the prime. The difficulty is that now we seem to have moved in a completely different, not from the cosmos to the universe, but from the universe to a cosmos. I mean, I wonder how many of you believe, even though this university is very famous for its technology, that we will actually go into space on Mars and the moon by millions. I mean, who is still emotively and intensively believing like we were when we were kids? I mean, I'm 64, so that was my imagination, of course, but we would actually move out in space. So there is still this infinite universe, but it's not for us. And that changed deeply the way we understand the cosmos. So we are back, in a way, to a limited and, what is completely unexpected, a contested cosmos. Every single element of the cosmos is now up for contestation. And when we talk about democracy and science, we should not forget that scientific controversies are about every single element which are now published in the journals. Michael was, in his introduction, reminding us of the loss of authority of science. It's not a loss of authority of science, I believe. It's the extension of a complete superposition of science and technology and our daily life, the fabric of our world. We contest global warming, but we also contest red tuna, the numbers of red tuna, and we contest GMO, and we contest about everything that is published in a scientific journal, which is good. But that's not the democracy that we imagine. It's not even the democracy that Monsieur Charpak imagined, where you would learn the fact and then people will become fact. Again, I mean, we'll have the mind made of fact. No, they have a mind made of exactly the same thing that we had when we were in democracy, conflict. And the conflicts are perfectly understandable because it's a question of life and death and reorganization of the very fabric of our life, of everybody. So how would you accept happily global warming? You can't. It means changing your life entirely. Who would? So you see that the very question of science and democracy has moved quite a lot in a way that probably would have not been thinkable for the Fleck, because it carries us into a direction when the authority of science has to be rebuilt completely. And here I passed a whole set of things which are Sloterdijkian meditation. So, conclusion. Is there a technology of representation for this question that is at the scale of a thought collective to be built? And here it is where I think the connection between the epistemology we learn from Fleck, renewed by lots of things which are done now in science studies, would be most productive, which is using the instrument of science to render possible this representation. And don't forget that representation always means science, science, art, and politics as well. It's the three points of representation which are central. Which is basically, and that I was very struck by the quote I didn't know that Michael cited before of Fleck, that it's actually exactly the prime, which probably, I think Ilana told me he knew quite well, Dewey as well, is coming from pragmatism, which is science as the instrumentation allowing the tracing of unintended consequences of collective action. It doesn't matter if it's done in laboratories, in satellites, in citizens' participation. It's a completely different definition of the link between science and democracy. And reading the beautiful book by Paul Edwards, A Vast Machine, which is a very detailed STS studies of the way modeling is done and where the global data about the global warming is coming from, which is a marvelous exploration of a very original epistemology produced by the meteorologist, we have an inkling of a sort of representative architecture that would render possible the question of scale, which are so difficult. Because after all, meteorologists and climate scientists had to solve the question of bringing the globe inside the centers of calculation. He actually, I didn't know this image, but he quoted this amazing image, which is the vision of Richardson, who is a famous climate scientist of the 1930s, who had invented a way of calculating the weather, but this was before computer. So imagine, in a sort of fiction, what it would be. And a very good BD artist called Frieden rendered the artist's rendition. So imagine a globe, and all of these guys are calculator at the time when calculator meant human calculator. Probably women, because at the time they were often, no, they are men actually, sorry, men and women. So they are not representative government here. It's not a representative government, it's a representative of weather prediction. And Richardson is very well known because even with all this machinery, he managed to calculate the time, I think, 2 years later after the event. So it was a failure in a way, but it was a great imagination of the problem of bringing the whole globe inside one center of calculation. And this problem is exactly the same if you are a scientist, if you are a politician, or if you are an artist. And that's why I'm so interested in the connection between the two. So there are lots of arguments in the book by Paul Edwards about, so it will be like using the difficulty and the uncertainties of the data production about global climate to give an inkling of what it is to represent the globe in this cosmopolitics we are talking about. So, what it is to take the world on our shoulders. And I want to finish on that democracy is not only procedures, it's not about vote, it's about stakeholders. What do you do when stakeholders are actually not anthropic in shape, just at the time when anthropic in force is stronger than them? And that's a completely new situation. That's an extreme, that's an age of extreme that we had not anticipated, and where the big, I think, the resources which has been created by this extraordinary autodidact, because he invented a field that didn't exist with his own word, trying to describe his practice, scientific practice in a time of extreme tension, would be extremely useful. And here I want to finish with this slide, which I took from Sloterdijk again, which is quite extraordinary, because this is Christopher holding the word on his shoulder, but you notice that the word is not only the child Christ, as it most often in the representation of Christopher, but the cosmic Christ child. So holding, ladies and gentlemen, this is our destiny if we want to survive. Thank you very much.